When entering the crime scene, we first took a broad look at everything ahead of us. Then we began to get closer toward the details. First, we noticed a trash bin immediately next to the entrance, which included a bloody tissue that we later performed a serology test on. The blood type could indicate the source of the blood. Then, we inspected shoe prints that led towards the body. These prints had the impression of either a boot or athletic shoe. We also performed a serology test on these prints. These prints could possibly narrow down suspects with that shoe type. As we went around the circumference of the room, we also saw some dirt near the north wall, which a trace evidence test later indicated as Miracle-Gro soil. This could assist in narrowing down suspects whose shoes connect to the soil. Next, we noticed a red Solo cup that contained sodium hypochlorite through a toxicology test. This chemical could have possibly been involved in the crime. There was also a quarter on the ground where the body had previously been. This could help narrow down suspects that carry money. We then found a Tom Thumb plastic bag with blood on it, which we performed a serology test on. This could help narrow down suspects that would have this brand of plastic bag. Then we looked at the blood pool that was under the victim's body. We performed a serology test to determine the blood type of this pool, to possibly connect it to other blood throughout the crime scene. The pool appeared to have smear marks, possibly linked to the blood tissue or plastic bag. There was also a pair of bloody scissors directly to the left of the blood pool, for which we performed a serology test. Every evidence of blood in the crime scene had the same blood type, likely coming from the same source. A fingerprint test found no fingerprints on the scissors. These scissors could possibly be the murder weapon, given that the puncture wounds were found on the victim. Near the body was also a Diet Coke can, which we would later perform a fingerprint test on. Since it was open, it could connect a suspect or the victim to the crime scene. Also on the cart were various cleaning supplies such as Clorox. We performed a fingerprint test on this bottle. Additionally, the main ingredient of Clorox is sodium hypochlorite, the chemical found also in the red Solo cup. This concluded our search of the crime scene. We then went to obtain the fingerprints from the Diet Coke can by using a dusting and lifting technique. We then had a variety of evidence and tests to begin looking for suspects. We interviewed possible suspects such as Mrs. Blackford, Mr. Wood, Mrs. Siegel, Coach Robinson, and Dr. Gruninger, but these interviews came up inconclusive due to their lack of connection to the evidence that we had collected. What is your relationship with Mrs. Carver?
Professional.
Okay. Do you drink soda?
No.
However, we began to identify our main suspects. The first is Mr. Host, who works in admissions. According to his interview, he has a close relationship with Mrs. Carver and has some possible connections to the crime scene.
We're very good colleagues, close colleagues.
since I worked with her during the admissions process when all of her sons were coming in, and she helped me out with a lot of 8th grade visits when I wouldn't be able to visit her classes and stuff. So, not vegetables, it's more like bulbs and perennials and trees and shrubs and stuff. I have a Kroger's card and what's the other one? Tom Thumb.
We then took his fingerprints so that we could later compare them to the ones found at the crime scene. Our next main suspect, Mr. Vaughn, is a physics teacher. He's worked alongside Mrs. Carver for the past 7 years. In his interrogation, he had many connections to the crime scene, which included him shopping at Tom Thumb, drinking Diet Coke, and keeping change on his person. We also took his fingerprints for comparison. Our last main suspect was Mrs. Sanchez, a chemistry teacher. She also had some connections to the crime scene, such as working with Mrs. Carver, drinking Diet Coke, gardening, and knowledge of the effects of sodium hypochlorite.
Last week, I was already being good, so I wasn't here, right? I was already in here I was here working. I've been working so hard lately. Yes, I was here.
What is your relationship with Miss Carver?
She is a fellow science teacher. My friend.
Do you have a pair of boots?
I look like I own boots. No, we do not.
Do you have Nike shoes?
Yes, I do.
Do you drink soda?
Yes.
What type?
Diet Coke.
Do you like gardening?
Yes.
What do you garden?
Plants. I mean, I don't like grow tomatoes or anything.
What type of soil do you use?
Oh, I don't know, whatever's in the bag.
Are you familiar with sodium hypochlorite?
Am I familiar with it?
Yeah.
Like we're on a first name basis? We are on a first name basis.
Yeah.
Do I use a lot of it? No.
Do you know what its like properties are? What it would do to a human being?
In what amounts?
Small amounts.
Oh, probably not make them feel very well.
When comparing the fingerprints found at the crime scene to those collected from our main suspects, we could not narrow down our suspects due to either the fingerprints not having similar characteristics or the fingerprint minutiae not being visible enough. Despite not being able to identify a single main suspect as the possible perpetrator, the autopsy results indicated a likely flow of events within the crime. The medical examiner noted chemical burns on the victim similar to those caused by sodium hypochlorite. Additionally, the examiner described several chemical injuries in the mouth and lungs. Both of these chemical-related injuries suggest that the victim had skin contact with the sodium hypochlorite found at the crime scene and possibly ingested and choked on it. The medical examiner also recorded a significant amount of hair and fibers on the victim's clothing, as well as a minor laceration to the victim's finger, indicating a possible struggle. Lastly, the medical examiner noted 16 puncture wounds in the abdominal area of the victim, likely coming after the chemical injuries, possibly from the scissors found at the crime scene. From these connections, we can begin to establish possible motives for the main suspects. Mr. Host, an avid collector of Pez dispensers, could have possibly become angry if his Pez were stolen. Mrs. Carver likes giving out candy to her students, so Mr. Host could have associated Mrs. Carver with this theft. Both Mr. Vaughn and Mrs. Sanchez work in the science department. They could have been motivated to commit the crime in order to become department chair and have oversight of the science department. However, without being able to directly connect any crime scene evidence to any possible suspects, we can still conjecture the flow of events in the crime. First, the perpetrator might have walked into the storage room and filled the Diet Coke can with sodium hypochlorite, knowing that Mrs. Carver likes to drink that soda. Mrs. Carver then enters the storage room and drinks the sodium hypochlorite. She then begins to choke on it, causing the chemical injuries. The perpetrator then comes back in the room and has a struggle with the victim, spilling sodium hypochlorite on the victim and causing the chemical burns. The perpetrator then could have used scissors to repeatedly stab the victim, causing the abdominal puncture wounds and killing the victim. Lastly, the perpetrator might have made an attempt to clean up the crime, but quickly left the scene, leaving behind some evidence. Without having narrowed down our suspects, the case remains unsolved, for now.